Or take this other element of liberal arts education, what we might call holism, that the various elements of one's life, your education, your social engagement, perhaps your faith, if that's a part of one's life, might interact with one another and weave together into a seamless whole. In addition to being a high-level academic, Gaël is also a Jesuit priest, having entered the Society of Jesus in 2004 and been ordained in 2013. We like to talk about the integration of faith and learning here at Westmont. Again, I think we have Exhibit A in Gaël Giraud. Finally, take the idea that learning can and should equip you for engaging in the world's deep needs and addressing complex real-world problems. In the early 2000s, Gaël served as a physics and mathematics teacher at a Jesuit high school in Chad, an experience that I suspect deeply shaped the course of his life and work. Or consider Gaël's recent appointment as the director of Georgetown's Environmental Justice Program, two different and powerful instances of learning in action. What I'm most fascinated by, though, is Gaël's involvement with the Transition Campus. In my opening remarks, I said that this conference all started with a beach walk with my colleague and friend Marianne Robbins. There's this new kind of school in France, she said. That was the Transition Campus, which is indeed not just a new academic institution, but maybe a new kind of academic institution, which is experimenting with answers to just the question that's been driving this conference for the last several days. What education do young people need now for the very different world they will inhabit as adults as a result of climate change? I won't steal any more thunder from Gaël on this topic because I think we'll hear more about it this morning, if not in the talk itself, then in discussion afterwards. I'll make sure of that. I'm really eager to hear about this. Gaël's talk this morning is titled "The Spiritual Challenges of a Fair Sustainability Transition." Please join me in welcoming Gaël Giraud.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation and for these beautiful days that we have the privilege to share together here in this marvelous place that I'm just discovering. So what I suggest is that I start straight away, and I need to put this on power, otherwise my laptop will die in 2 seconds. I'm coming. Thank you, and sorry for the interruption. So, first of all, I would like to stress that my experience, both as a researcher, let's say as a teacher, and as an activist, is that everything is connected, and that definitely we need a holistic approach. So let me show you a few examples that I guess illustrate that. The first one has something to do with a paper that we are going to publish with my team at the Environmental Justice Program, Georgetown University, which starts with an experience that I guess all of us have made already, at least myself. If you try to do your jogging in the savannah of Chad, where I spent a few years, or in the jungle of Vietnam, where I used to teach at Hanoi University, it's much hotter in Chad, but it's much easier to run in Chad than in the jungle. Why? Because in the jungle, even though it's not that hot, it's very, very humid. And humidity prevents your body from sweating. And if you cannot sweat, your body cannot cool itself, and you just die. So here you have a rate curve, and that's a clinical experiment, which shows that there are combinations of heat, the x-axis, and humidity, the y-axis, which are lethal for an average human body, not for Chris, who is very sporty, but for me or for everybody else, after 6 hours. So if you are exposed to this more than 6 hours, and you cannot rely on air conditioning, you just die. And so the question we asked ourselves is, where are people going to be exposed to these kind of lethal combinations of heat and humidity in the near future, at the end of this century, under a number of scenarios, combining both climate change and economics? And the answer is the following, and it's rather frightening. So this is the business as usual scenario, taking into account the fact that we would not really implement the Anti-Inflation Act or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act or anything like a Green New Deal in Europe, etc., etc. This would lead us to something like plus 3.5 degrees Celsius at the end of this century as a global temperature anomaly. And so this is the conclusion. So the color is very easy to interpret. If it's dark red or brown, it means you are exposed to these lethal combinations of heat and humidity pretty much every day during the year. If it's light yellow, it means 1 day over 3 every third day. If it's orange, approximately 1 second day, every second day, okay? So as you can see here, if we don't do anything, essentially most of the Amazon basin will be just uninhabitable. Central America will be hell on earth. The southeastern coast of the US will be very, very painful. People will be exposed to these kind of lethal combinations every third day at least, you know. And you know that air conditioning is not the solution. There was a report published by the US Army and NASA by 2019, before the pandemic, asking the question, what could prevent the US Army from implementing its mission in the decade 2020? And the answer was twofold. First, pandemics, and this was before COVID-19. And second, power blackouts due to the overuse of air conditioning, which is already happening here in California, in Texas, etc., etc. So air conditioning will not be the solution. But as you can see, the Guinea Gulf will also be very, very painful. And India will be in a very, very bad shape, not even mentioning Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. And so this means that probably if we don't do anything or if we don't do much, there will be gigantic migrations. We are speaking about billions of people. Think just of India and Southeast Asia. You can also notice that the eastern coast of China, with very small cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, etc., will also be very hot and humid, so people will have to migrate. So we are talking about billions of migrants on this planet. So you can imagine a huge chaos. In order to have this kind of very gloomy picture, I'm sorry for that, you need to have a conversation between climate scientists and economists, which is, to the best of my knowledge, very new actually, because if you listen to mainstream economists, they will tell you, like Bill Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Award, well, you know, climate change is not a big deal because if we have plus 6 degrees Celsius of temperature anomaly at the end of this century, we will lose only like 10% of the global GDP, which is just ludicrous as a statement, okay? So this is completely new from the viewpoint of economists. From your viewpoint, it might be not a great news, but I can tell you, for economists, it's completely new. And so also something interesting from this, we asked Alisa Singer, maybe you know her. She is the painter who is realizing all the cover pages of IPCC reports. And so we gave her this map, plus the map of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, so big balloons that you see, so for the US, China, etc. And she drew this painting. So we tried to combine both arts and science, because our experience, like yours, is that if you don't touch the heart of people, you know, this is just frightening, does not give a lot of incentives to act, and this is much more, I mean, if you find it beautiful, also much more compelling. Now the second aspect is water. You know this in California, but so we are going to enter into a big crisis of water. So this has not been done by us, but by the World Resources Institute, and this is for 2040. This is a lack of access to fresh water if we don't do anything. This time, for instance, Europe is badly hit by this. It's already a big problem in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and it's, as you know, it's already a big problem in Northern Africa, etc., etc. And the question is even worse. That is, already by 2030, we know that the demand gap in terms of water, fresh water, that is the gap between demand and supply, will be of at least 40%. So 40% of the demand, the global demand for fresh water by 2030, that is just the day after tomorrow, will not be fulfilled at the world level. And then here, what you see is that there is a connection between climate change, global warming, and the lack of access to fresh water, and a connection between these two questions and the lack of biomass that I'm going to turn to now. So this is the production of biomass at the world level. Of course, you recognize both the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and the rainforest of Southeast Asia. And this is the consumption of biomass by human beings. Completely different picture, completely different map. So people eat or consume biomass in places where they don't grow this biomass. They rely, therefore, on exports and imports, international value chains, of which we have seen that they are very vulnerable, at least against a small virus, not mentioning the big troubles that we are going probably to face in the coming years. So this is the balance. So if you are like black or dark red, it means that you have a huge deficit in terms of biomass. You heavily rely on imports of biomass from elsewhere. And we have no guarantee that these international trades of biomass, agricultural produces, will still remain in place in the coming decades. So especially India, as you see, the north of India and China are and the Java Island in Indonesia are in a big, very, very fragile situation. So climate change, water, biomass, and the fourth item, of course, is the growing scarcity of a number of minerals, which are absolutely key to get these kind of beautiful objects, or my computer. So if you look just at this diagram here, which comes from a paper of mine with a friend of mine who is a geophysicist, this is the exponential growth of extraction of copper, zinc, and aluminium since the Second World War. When you show this at the world level, and when you show this to a geophysicist, he will tell you, well, it's just unsustainable. Why? Because there is a finite quantity of copper on Earth. More precisely, even though there is a huge amount of copper which is still in the Earth today, the density of reserves of copper is declining very dangerously. So 40 years ago, it was 5%, which means in order to get 5 tons of copper, you needed to deal with 100 tons of soil, to dig, etc. Today, it's 1%, so 5 times less. And of course, the cost in terms of money and energy and water to extract this copper is not linear, it's exponential as a function of the density of the reserve. So there you see the link between water, biomass, minerals, and climate change. As an illustration of that, think of what's happening today in Tunisia. So Tunisia has a big problem of access to fresh water, as you see here, North Africa. And when I served as the chief economist of the French agency, French Development Agency, the government told us, well, we need to find a solution in order to have access to fresh water, at least for the agriculture. It's a food security problem. It's a national security problem for us. The unique solution we came up with was desalination of water, or desalination of water, of the seawater of the Mediterranean Sea. But for that purpose, you need a big plant, you need to pump out that water, and therefore you need a lot of electricity, a lot of power. And Tunisia doesn't have the chance that Morocco has to have a big solar power plant like in Ouarzazate. So Tunisia had to first figure out how to have this kind of big solar plant in order to produce electricity, not even for its people, but just in order to desalinate water, the seawater. And for this big solar plant, you need a number of minerals which are getting scarcer and scarcer. So there you see the nexus between water, biomass, and agriculture, clean energy, and minerals. And so my viewpoint is that we need to address all these questions together, otherwise we are just missing the elephant in the room. And so the countries in the coming decades which will be safe are those countries which will have access to the 4 items together, because once one item misses, you cannot have access to the 3 others, or it's going to become very complicated. So again, in terms of minerals and matter, there is a beautiful work that probably you're aware of, published by the IRP, the International Resource Panel, which is the analog of IPCC for minerals and matter for the United Nations. So I just published a report for IRP, and the main takeaway is that, let me just give you 3 figures. First, the weight, the mass of matter that we consume, quote unquote, per capita and per year. Today, on average, it's a little bit more than 12 tons per capita per year, on average, at the global level. The maximum, as you can guess, is in the US with 27 tons. 27 tons. The minimum is 2 tons, probably in Chad, Somalia, Ethiopia, etc. So you see the huge gap. And if you try to compute the average mass that we should be consuming if we were compatible with the 2-degree threshold at the end of this century, it should be close to 6 tons. So the average today is 12, the US 27, the minimum 2, and we should reach probably something like 6. So you see the huge challenge that is behind this, the huge transformation that we have to imagine and to put into practice. In terms of industry, this means that, unfortunately, and I know this is very provocative in California, we have to get rid of these marvelous things because this is almost impossible to recycle. It's very, very costly to recycle. So some people in Europe call these kind of beautiful objects ghost objects, that is, objects that we will never recycle, that will be obsolete sooner or later, that we will not be able to repair because it will be too costly, and that will remain with us for centuries. So we are already living today with ghost objects, and we need to imagine, and that's a big challenge, also just in terms of imagery, a new type of industry which is based on very simple manufactured products, exactly the opposite of that, with products easy to repair and easy to recycle. And long-life products, not products that become obsolete after 3 years, like this beautiful object here, okay? And I know this is just mind-blowing. I can tell you the first time I explained this to very, world-class industrial people, business leaders in the north of Italy, and you may know that the north of Italy is as effective and efficient as Germany or Switzerland, and they just opened their eyes. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. They had literally never heard of that, and they'd really discovered the problem. The last piece of bad information I want to convey before going to good information, positive information, is of course inequality. You know this graph probably, which has been introduced for the first time by Branko Milanovic, a leading economist at the World Bank. So the idea is very simple. The x-axis is the scale of income distribution. So if you belong to this segment, it means you belong to the bottom 10% of the population in terms of income, while if you are at the opposite, you belong to the 10 or 1%, top 1% of the population in terms of income. And the y-axis is the part of income growth rate that accrued to you, that you received in the past 30 or 40 years, if I remember correctly. And so Branko's idea was to say, well, capitalism in the past 40 years have been characterized by an elephant. That is, of course, the elite, to which we all belong here, has received a lot. That's, the trump of the elephant. But also the middle class. That's the head of the elephant and the back of the elephant, okay? Unfortunately, it happens that a number of colleagues have redone the computations with other type of data and have come up with a different animal, which is the Loch Ness monster. So the middle class was not so privileged as Branko would claim, and definitely, there is a big bias in the distribution of income growth in the past 40 years at the world level, okay? And of course, we have to deal with that because the more unegalitarian our society is, the more difficult it will be to implement bold solutions in terms of sustainability transition. So my point is to say we need a holistic approach to deal with all these questions because they are interconnected. And we know that climate change is hitting more deeply the populations which are more vulnerable and which are less responsible for the whole mess we are in. And we have to take into account both global warming, natural resources depleting, especially water, social inequalities, the question of biomass, and I didn't mention that also infectious diseases. You know that, so we know that COVID-19 comes from a leak in a Chinese lab, but we also know that there are a number of zoonoses that are going to spread in the coming years or decades because of deforestation and because of global warming. Global warming will also spread tropical diseases from the equator to the poles, and we also know that if permafrost in Siberia and Alaska melts further in the coming decades, permafrost might liberate a number of very, very ugly diseases which are frozen for hundreds of years over there, like anthrax, maybe the Spanish flu from 1918, etc., etc. So we have to take this into account, and that's what I'm trying to do. Just an illustration of this big, complex challenge. When I served as a chief economist, the bank decided to adopt this as a framework for its own understanding of development. What does it mean? So the x-axis is HDI, the Human Development Index, which is published every year in New York by HDRO, the United Nations office responsible for the HDI, Human Development Index, which is built on 3 pillars: GDP per capita, a measure of the level of education, and a measure of the level of health in the society, which is already much better than just GDP, and which goes in the direction of what Jeff said yesterday. And the y-axis is the ecological footprint. That is, this is one measure of the anthropic impact of our own activities on natural ecosystems. If your ecological footprint is higher than 1, it means you need more than 1 planet to survive, which is not sustainable in the long run for sure. So the carrying capacity of the planet was at this level in 1961. And in 2012, it went down because of the destruction of a number of ecosystems that we are unfortunately implementing. Okay, and so each point is a country. Every country which lies above the carrying capacity of 2012, which probably itself is above the carrying capacity of today, is not sustainable. And in terms of HDI, the international community agrees that if you have an HDI which is below 0.8, the HDI is always between 0 and 1. If it's below 0.8, which was a couple of years ago the HDI of Russia, then it's not extraordinary. If you're above 0.8, it's okay. And so if we want to have a cool, nice, sustainable society, we need to have a country which exhibits an HDI which is above 0.8 to the right, and which is below the carrying capacity. In other words, in this magic square, which obviously is empty. So which means, in the US, as you can guess, the US is somewhere over there, very high. And Chad is somewhere here. Okay. So most sub-Saharan African countries are on the bottom left, and most quote-unquote developed countries are on the top right. Which means everybody has to do something. There is no such thing as just mimicking, the first world or the second world. We all have to change, but in different ways. Sub-Saharan African countries have to go to the right, that is to increase their HDI without increasing the ecological footprint, while we have to go down, that is to decrease our ecological footprint without decreasing our HDI, which is already a big challenge. But a couple of years ago, there was one country which was exactly at this point. I'll let you guess which country it was. Does anybody know? It was Cuba. And so, of course, when you see this, you think, well, just to go in the direction of Cuba and to take Cuba as a model does not sound completely right. Okay? Why? for a number of reasons. So actually there should be a third dimension in this diagram, and we should all struggle and strive to go to this magic rectangle, and at the same time promote democracy and human rights. Because if we have to just get rid of democracy in order to end up over there, that's not good news either, okay? So in my understanding, this is a very simple way to frame the big challenge that we are facing. And the way I believe we have to educate our kids and our students is to let them understand that, and to let them understand that this is the challenge that their generation have to solve, has to face, okay? Now, action. So what I'm doing with my research team now at Georgetown, I just want very quickly to describe this to you. So first of all, we are working with indigenous populations in the Amazon. It happens that just by a stroke of chance, I know a leader of these indigenous populations whose name is Patricia Walinga. She's a fantastic woman. She's nowadays, so to say, the spokeswoman of these tribes. And what she told me a couple of months ago is that, look, she said, we have, the Amazon, it does not exist as a polity. We have to talk with 5 different governments, including France, by the way, because France has the French Guiana, which is also an Amazonian country. And when we talk to them, they just ask us, but who are you? You don't belong to a polity which is called the Amazon. This does not exist. Same story when we talk with big businesses. And so she asked us to provide her and her population with a hybrid model that would combine macroeconomics, finance, biomass, climate change, natural resources, diseases, tropical diseases, so that they could run simulation and talk with the counterparts, governments, businesses, etc., saying, hey, look, if you keep doing this, like deforesting the Amazon, this is what's going to happen in a few years, and this is not compatible with the defense of our rights. So what we do essentially is that we provide her and her population with, quote unquote, a weapon to be able to bargain with governments and businesses. Another example is that we are also working with GRS, which is the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is a big NGO which has been founded in 1975, and which has a number of big refugee camps in the north of Kenya, among many other places. And what they told us is that today, the average time someone spends in a refugee camp is 17 years. So a camp is no longer, a transitory place where you come for a few months and then you go home. You enter the camp, you get kids in the camp, you die in the camp. So the main problem, the main challenge today is to help refugees escape from the camp, paradoxically enough, and to help them resettle in the country where they are, even though this country might not be their home country. So that's what they want to do in Kenya. And so we are going to provide them with a complete mapping of the aquifer groundwater resources in Kenya, because it happens that by chance there is a lot of groundwater in Kenya. And we are also going to provide them with a toolkit so that they can understand how to have decentralized PV, photovoltaic, as a source of electricity, to have electric pumps, to have light, and to be able to farm, as simple as this. So this is gigantic, because we are speaking about hundreds of thousands of people. There are many, of course, anthropological problems, like in the discussion with the Amazonian population, you can imagine that. We have to talk with the government, because the government has to give its green light and to understand that this is profitable even for the Kenyan population, etc., etc. And I give you this example because this is where we need like engineers knowing how to map aquifer resources. We need anthropologists, we need political scientists, sociologists working with us. Otherwise, we know from the beginning that it will be a big mess. So this is where I believe action oriented towards a concrete problem that has to be solved on the field forces us to get rid of all the silos that prevent us from working with reality in a classical standard university. Maybe I won't get tenure in Georgetown with this, but who honestly cares about that? But we are trying to save these hundreds of thousands of people, you see? And by the way, I will get tenure anyway, so. South Africa is the third example. So we are working directly with the National Treasury of South Africa. South Africa today is facing three main challenges together, and the main problem is try to fix them at the same time. The first one, obviously, is that they have to transition from a coal mine-based economy towards renewable energies, which is already a challenge in itself. Second, today, the fraction of the youth, of the black youth population, which is jobless, is 65.5%. 65% of the black youth is jobless in South Africa today, which is incredible, unheard of. And last year, the World Bank labeled South Africa as being the most unegalitarian country in the world. Third, it happens that the main utility provider in South Africa, which is called Eskom, which is a state-owned company providing electricity for everybody, is essentially bankrupt and has a huge amount of public debt that nobody knows how to repay or how to pay back. So they have to face these three challenges at the same time, and the National Treasury asked us again to build with them a hybrid model with macroeconomics and finance, climate, natural resources. Because at the same time, as you may know probably, South Africa is deeply hit and concerned by global warming. So every year now for 5 years, Cape Town comes very close to the day zero. That is the day where there is no water on tap. And fortunately, so far, each year they had a kind of providential rain which prevented this from happening. But everybody knows that sooner or later they will have to make this terrible experience of having no water on tap, like La Paz in Bolivia in 2016. And you may know that we can survive without electricity. We cannot survive without water. Nobody. Okay. The last example, I guess, no, it's not the last one, but one of the last ones is Mongolia. It happens that in Mongolia, which is a very small country in terms of population, 3 million people, but just between Russia and China, so today in terms of, in geopolitical terms, it's a key country. The nomadic population is starving because the cattle are dying because of global warming. So the nomads have to try to settle down, and most of them get slumified in the slums of Ulaanbaatar, the capital city. So the ambassador of Mongolia to the United Nations asked us whether we could help them launch a network of organic farms where these people could settle down. And again, this is not just a problem for engineers or even economists, because to help a nomadic population settling down is a big anthropological challenge. So we need to work with anthropologists who know pretty well this small population to help us understand how we can discuss with them, with NGOs obviously, in order not to provoke a new tragedy, but to really help them on the field. The last example is Ukraine. We are working on a model for Ukraine because it happens that the World Bank, the IMF, and a big think tank in the UK have conceived reconstruction plans, green reconstruction plans for a post-war Ukraine, which hopefully will happen one day. But nobody knows whether these plans really hold water. So we are offering to build a model where they will be able to check. We will be able to compare these various scenarios and to check whether they're really feasible concretely. So I don't have time to enter into all this. I will go back to this if you ask me questions. For all this, there is a pedagogical aspect. That is, sooner or later we will need to open training centers for our counterparts in order to train civil servants and researchers in the countries over there, so that they can just metabolize the kind of model we are building with them, because these are non-orthodox models, completely different from the classical economic models used by the World Bank or the IMF, which are usually called CGE for those who know what it means. So we need to train them. And we plan to open a training center in Kenya and maybe another one in Ecuador for the Amazonian population. And so the idea that I have in mind, even though we haven't started this yet, is to take as an example, as a model, the so-called ecological campuses I know, among which there is this transition campus in the south of Paris. So to my mind, the best example is the Sustainability Institute in Stellenbosch University, South Africa, where I used to teach, which is a piece of the campus which is located inside an eco-village. So all the water is recycled. All the electricity comes from PV on the roof. All the buildings have been built with ecological materials. Everybody is vegetarian. and everybody goes gardening before entering the classroom on the campus. So me as a teacher, when I come in the morning early, I have to garden at least half an hour with my students, possibly 1 hour, and then we enter the amphitheater. And I can tell you this changes completely the pedagogical atmosphere in the classroom, because the students immediately make the existential experience that the prof is no longer, the guy who claims he knows everything and who's going to teach us what to do, even though his generation has messed up everything. But he's the guy who is struggling with us because we are all in the same boat, okay? And we are all going to drown together if we don't find solutions. So my experience over there is just incredible. And when I came to Georgetown, of course, I said immediately, we should think about, going this direction. I can tell you it's a big challenge. So my next example is not Georgetown, not yet. So it is the Schumacher College near Totnes in the Devon, southwest of England. And the third example is the transition campus in Paris. So by the way, Schumacher College, of course, has the unique privilege of being located in an old British manor, which gives, of course, a charm which is just incredible. But it's a beautiful place. So if you have the opportunity to go there just 1 week, I can give you this anecdote. I did it when I was a chief economist of the French bank with 20 of my colleagues. And we took with us the woman who was responsible so she was the director of risk management in the bank. And you can imagine the person who is responsible for risk management in the bank is a very important person. She has a hold on the entire portfolio of the bank, assessing the risk every second minute, okay? And so after 1 day, first my colleagues discovered that they would not eat meat during 1 week. So some of them were wondering, are we going to survive, The chief economist is really crazy. And then she, the director of risk management, we had a meeting at the end of the first day, and she said, well, of course, we are not here on behalf of the bank, we are just here individually, and everything that's going to happen here does not concern our work in the bank. So she was already developing a rhetoric in order to protect herself from what was happening. And then I said, no, I'm your chief economist, and this is during your working, hours. So you are here on behalf of the bank, and what's happening here is of utterly importance for us. And then after 5 days, she came back to me, and she didn't say it publicly in front of everybody, but she came back to me and she said, well, actually, everything we are doing in the bank is just shit. So she experienced a kind of conversion, an ecological conversion, which was just incredible. So I encourage you to do the same, not necessarily in the Schumacher College, but in any place which looks like this, which helps people, make this kind of conversion. Why are we so blind? And this is where I believe anthropology and spirituality enter the picture. First of all what I'm mentioning has been anticipated. That's very, very frightening. There is a beautiful book by Richard, who was the director of the World Bank for Europe. He published this book in 2002. It's called High Noon. And if you read it, you have the impression that he's describing what's happening today, except that he published his book 20 years ago. Another point which is very frightening, I don't know whether you're aware of that, is that the American historian Mike Davis published a book which is called Late Victorian Holocausts, where he describes that in the late 19th century, in the last decade, there was a series of El Nino phenomena, and you all know what El Nino is, El Nino effect, and which has been completely neglected by the colonial administrations back then. And this led to something like 50 million dead. Brazil, Africa, India, China. So first of all, this means that, it's not true that we always succeed in finding an exit door when we have a big crisis. And second, we have completely forgotten it, which to me is even more frightening, because this is more serious than the First World War, if you think about it. 50 million people dead. And so the question is not only why do we not listen to those people who anticipate, but how can we draw lessons from the past if we just forget the past? Okay. And the third point I want to mention from a historical perspective is the following one. If you think of all the challenges of the nexus that I was alluding to earlier, probably some people claim, and whether they're right or not is debatable, is controversial. Some people claim that we have to invent a stationary economy or a stationary society, even in terms of population growth, GDP growth, everything. Then the question is, if this is true, do we have an example of a society which found a way to become stationary? And the answer is yes, one country, maybe there are others, but that's a unique one I'm aware of, which is Japan in the 17th century, at the beginning of the Tokugawa era. So there is a beautiful PhD dissertation called The Green Archipelago, which describes this story. So back then, the so-called shogun, the big head of the Japanese army, discovered that they were cutting trees at a pace which is higher than the pace at which trees grow in Japan. And they understood that if they were keeping doing this, they would die, because without forestry, there is nothing in Japan. And so the shogun implemented a stationary society by asking every couple to have only 2 kids, so a lot of infanticides, etc., and by capping the number of trees that each couple could cut every year. And if you were caught cutting more trees, you would be tortured a la Japanese, which is not funny. And so, of course, it was very violent, but it was successful. So I'm not saying this is the model we should implement. I'm just saying at least there is one society which did it. And what is very interesting is that still today we are fascinated, I guess, by the Japanese aesthetic, which is illustrated here. It's a kind of minimal aestheticism, where everything is very light. But if you think about it, maybe this is the kind of aesthetics that goes hand in hand with a light society which reduces its material footprint, as we should do. I'm not saying we should all become Japanese, but I'm saying this is a very interesting example that we should reflect upon, both from a historical point of view, also philosophical, aesthetical point of view. So now, the next point, still from an anthropological viewpoint, is that, so part of my research is also dedicated to this. Probably part of the problem is that we, at least economists, we used to think of the planet as being shaped by 2 kinds of goods: private goods, which belong to the market, and public goods, which belong to the public administration. This is just an old heritage from law, Roman law actually, which divides between res privata in Latin and res publica. And so Elinor Ostrom, whom you know probably, who got the Nobel Award in 2009 in economics, even though she was not an economist, has done a fantastic job illustrating how there are 2 other types of goods. The club goods, like this one, if I'm alone to have a phone or to be connected to WhatsApp or to internet on the planet, it's completely useless. If we are 8 billions, then it becomes valuable, so that's a club good. And common goods. So common goods are usually defined as being goods whose consumption is rival. That is, if you consume too much of it, you destroy it. But whose access cannot be regulated by a price or a tax. So the usual example is a pond in Guinea-Conakry, where I went to in order to support fisheries. And so there is a tribe which lives from fisheries in this pond. And if you go fishing during the night and you cut all the trophic chains of fishes, then there won't be fish anymore next year. So the consumption is rival. But you cannot put a policeman behind every tree around the pond, because that's just impossible. So the access cannot be regulated in the same way a private good can be regulated, you see. So that's a fragile good which is open to everybody, but which is necessary for everybody. You could think of education as a common good. You could think of course, culture, climate, health, etc., etc. So my main hypothesis is that maybe we have to learn how to turn a number of goods that are precious, that we want to foster and to keep and to protect, to save. We have to save them from being privatized, which destroys them, from being just the object of public administration, which is communism, let's say. But we have to find institutions that can take care of them as commons. Does this exist? Yes. The whole work of Elinor Ostrom shows example of communities which have learned how to treat water as a common. And we have done it at the French European Bank when we saw what happened in La Paz, Bolivia, in 2016, as I said earlier. La Paz is this big capital city 4,000 meters high, which is now in a desert because of global warming. And then during the summer, they made the experience of no water on tap. So the upper class in the center of the city was literally starving, but the poorest in the suburbs of La Paz still had water because they had organized themselves, especially with women. It works much better with women when they are in charge than with men. Don't ask me why. And so they still had water because they were managing water as a common good, neither as a private good nor as a public good, even less so as a club good. And so we tried at the French Bank to foster these kind of initiatives. We did exactly the same in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Tunisia, etc., etc. And so these are local examples which are very famous today, and there are many, many scholars working on the commons. Then the next question would be, does this exist also at the global level? Because health is obviously a global question, as we have made the experience during the pandemic. The health of a family in Wuhan matters for me. Fishes in the ocean, climate, biodiversity, etc., etc. And I know one example, which I believe is very, very illuminating, which is called DNDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative in Switzerland, Geneva. It's a platform where you have a discussion between the private sector, big pharma, governments, and NGOs. And what they try to do is to provide therapies against neglected disease by the private sector. One example is hepatitis C in Egypt. So the private sector is completely neglecting this because Egyptians are too poor, so it's uninteresting from a business viewpoint. But in DNDI, Big Pharma accepted to work hand in hand with governments and with NGOs in order to provide this kind of therapy for something like $300, $400, while a therapy against hepatitis C in Europe costs at least 2,000 euros. And so this is a way to treat health no longer as a private good, not as a public good, because it's not just the state who is doing the whole job, but as a common, where in order to deal with it and to manage it, you need a real collaboration between the three actors which usually compete against each other, namely the private sector, the public sector, and the civil society. And I believe that's the future. So what we need is to invent new types of institutions at the world level which can take care of our global commons. Look at what happened with the United Nations during the pandemic. The Security Council didn't say anything, which is a little bit worrying, no? Because this was the first time after the Second World War we would have such a huge global catastrophe, and the United Nations didn't say anything. Same story for the war in Ukraine, for obvious reasons, but anyway. So I'm not saying that the United Nations have become useless, but I say we need other institutions which can take care of now what we need, namely to take care of global commons. So, and last word, and I will stop here. There is behind all this, I believe, an anthropological question, a big, deep anthropological question. Why? So you know this drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, for sure. And there are, which is called L'Uomo di Vitruvio in Italian. And there are a number of people, and I'm sure this is the case in this room, because it was my case a couple of years ago, who would think spontaneously, well, that's an image, that's an illustration of mankind, humanity. And then the question is, how come we believe that, we Westerners? Because actually, when you think about it, this is a male, so half of the human population is not there. This is a white guy, obviously, so more than half of the population is not there. He's in good shape, an adult, kids and elderly are not there. And he's completely alone. Nature is not there. So he's there, completely naked, in a complete metaphysical solitude in front of the universe, equipped with what? Geometry, which means science and technology. And so behind this, there is this idea that the white male, the white European male is going to dominate the entire creation, the nature, thanks to science and technology. So of course, immediately you think, well, of course I don't agree with that, but let's be honest. So many people in Western countries believe this to be true, no? And maybe part of our curricula are still shaped today with this underlying anthropology and actually even cosmology. At least it's a question that I'm raising. So As an extreme opposite to that, there is this concept by the French philosopher whom you know probably, Jacques Derrida, no? Which is called carno-phallogocentrism. So carno is from Latin, which means meat. Phallogo, phallus. Logo, logos in Greek. Centrism. So it's the idea that there is something in common between the fact that most of us eat meat, which is a way, even though we don't need it, which is a way to tell to ourselves, I am at the top of the pyramid of predators of the entire planet. That's why I can eat meat. Second, I'm a male, and the domination of males over women is something which is, rooted in, the essence of mankind, which of course is not true, and logos, I'm a Westerner, and of course the Greek logos is a way to say rationality in the way I understand it is universal, and everybody should comply to this. Otherwise you are just dumb, So that's his idea, and the main interesting point is to say there is something in common in all this. These are not just three problems which happen just by coincidence to surface together, but these are three symptoms of the same main problem, which is a bizarre relationship to the other. Be it the woman for myself as a man, be it nature, be it indigenous people, etc., etc. So there is behind this a relationship, a violent relationship with alterity, with otherness, which is hidden behind this image. Okay? And so there is a French anthropologist who studied this, whose name is Philippe Descola, and he ended up with the idea that actually our relationship with nature is very, very specific and very actually peculiar. So this is what he called naturalism. And naturalism, according to him, is the idea that this guy here is facing nature, and nature is just in front of him, is not part of him, is in front of him, is inert, deaf, mute. And he can do whatever he wants with nature. He can destroy it, he can measure it, he can model it with mathematics, physics, etc., etc. But it's something that is an object. Nature is definitely not a subject. And in comparison, there are a number of human populations on the planet which think completely differently about the relationship with nature. So there are at least three other ways to understand it. Animism, which is very well known. Totemism, which is a little bit different. So animism, you know this. So for instance, a lot of populations, Inca populations, in the Andes, in Peru, have an animist viewpoint or metaphysics. Totemism was very spread in America before the first Spaniards came, and totemism is the idea that I share both my physicality and my interiority with my totem, be it an eagle, or a jaguar, or some type of animal. And if I kill my totem, I will die because I'm killing myself. So this is another cosmology. And the last one is, analogism, which was quite widespread in Europe before the 17th century. Analogism is the idea that I don't share anything in common with the tree over there, but there is an analogy between the tree and myself whose apex is God in the medieval understanding of the cosmos. And if you look back at beautiful treatises in theology like, the celestial hierarchies by the pseudo-Dionysius, how do you say this in English? The Areopagite. That's exactly the kind of vision of the cosmos that he's conveying. I have no essential relationship with the tree, but I'm related to this tree thanks to God and thanks to a myriad of analogies where you find the angels, etc., etc. You see? So it happens that, according to Descola, a number of populations also have an analogical cosmology, like the ancient imperial China and a number of other populations. So the big question for us is, do we have to get rid of naturalism in order to have a better relationship to nature? Do we have to put our brain, outside our head and to think completely differently? Or should we talk with indigenous populations which understand the relationship with nature in a completely different way? Are we the guys who are supposed to listen to instead of teaching everybody how to become a Westerner, etc., etc.? Big, big questions, which of course echo the challenges that we face in education. Last word, there is a beautiful work by Eduardo Viveros de Castro, a Brazilian anthropologist, who challenges Descolas' taxonomy by saying, there are populations in the Amazon which have a viewpoint which is even not animist, totemist, or analogist, which is still different, which he called perspectivismo in Brazilian, in Portuguese. And that's the following idea. It should be this one first. So the human being in the Amazon thinks that there are a number of animals which are different. So the jaguar obviously is a predator, it's dangerous, but the toucan is beautiful, but I don't eat it. Maybe I don't remember how to call it in English, this one. Is delicious to eat, and the monkey over there is so-so to eat, but it's not dangerous. Now there is a completely different viewpoint, which is jaguar. The jaguar sees the toucan as something uninteresting, the human being over there as dangerous but delicious to eat, etc., etc. You see? And then, according to these populations that Eduardo Viveros de Castro studied and lived with, it's not clear whether the human being is this guy in the center or this guy in the center. Who knows? They don't claim that a priori they know who the human being in the room is. And that's why they eat people that we call human beings. Because for them, these people are not humans, while maybe the jaguar over there is a true human being, you see? So this challenges completely our own categories. And it's a fascinating book to read. It's called Cannibal Metaphysics Cannibais, Cannibal Metaphysics. I encourage you to read it. And I do believe if we want to enter into the logic of really listening to alternative cosmologies, we have to enter into this discussion. I know that Eduardo Viveros de Castro has been challenged by a number of other anthropologists, but that's even more fascinating. So maybe in order to get rid of the implicit naturalism, which is, ingrained in ourselves, we have to enter into this. And as you can guess, this is a big spiritual challenge. How do we do that? I believe the golden rule in the gospel is key for that purpose. So one version of the golden rule, in Luke's gospel is to say, and as you would that men should do to you, do you also to them likewise. So I provided a number of quotes showing that this is not just Christian, it's deeply rooted in the Jewish spirituality and tradition, obviously. Within the New Testament, you have Matthew's version, Luke's version, and obviously, maybe you know this, there is a whole stream of literature in philosophy which builds on that. First, beginning with Immanuel Kant, but also Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, and today you have a German-French theologian whose name is Christophe Theobald, who builds on that, and who says essentially the idea of holiness inside Christianity builds essentially on this spiritual experience, to put my feet in the shoes of the other, because that's the prerequisite in order to really experiment the golden rule. If I want to know whether the jaguar here is a human being, I first have to make the experience of putting my feet in his shoes. I know it's not easy. I'm not saying I'm You're right. Yeah. So, and probably you know that the golden rule is a kind of universal anthropological invariant. It's like the incest ban, And so if you go to the Wikipedia page dedicated to the golden rule, you will see in pretty much every civilization, people have something analogous to the golden rule. So the golden rule is not just a kind of ethical rule or spiritual rule for us Christians, but seems to be a place where we can enter into a universal dialogue with pretty much everybody on earth. So this might be a good start, to try to make this experience, to get rid of our implicit naturalism in order to enter into a completely different relationship to nature. By doing so, we are challenging the Christian tradition itself. Why? Because as you probably know, everybody is challenging us Christians by saying that, you have this verse in Genesis 1:28, which says that God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and the sea, etc., etc. This is the big question of the dominium terrae in Latin. And you have already in the 60s someone like Lynn White, the Protestant historian, who said, well, Christians are responsible for all this mess because they believe in that. They believe in the dominium terrae. But then the big question is, if we believe that the golden rule is key for Christian holiness, how should we interpret and understand dominion? Is dominion a violent way to exert power over the other? Like, where is it? Here? Is this dominion? Is ecofeminism a way to say, well, women should have dominion over men, or vice versa? But if we do this, we haven't changed anything. We have just replaced the actors, okay? We haven't made any progress. Or is dominion something different inside the Bible? And my understanding is that the Gospels tell us a completely different story, because Christ was called to become the king of Jerusalem, of Israel, of the entire planet. And as a king, he entered Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a horse, like every Roman emperor should have done. And of course, the whole theology of the lamp is exactly the opposite of a violent dominion. And if you go to the book of Revelation 3:20-21, you read this, which is just mind-blowing. Behold, I stand at the door and I knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come to him and will sup with him, and he with me. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne. That's in the book of Revelation. So Christians believe in a God who is offering to share the ultimate and absolute power, the throne of the Father, with every holy human being, and maybe also other creatures. So if this is the ultimate truth of Christianity, it means that the dominion, which is alluding to here, has nothing to do with violent power. It's exactly the opposite. Power, according to Christians, is a common good that we are called to share with everybody, and probably with the entire creation. And I will stop here, definitely. That's the last slide, with a small parable, which is due to a German Aufklärer in German from the 18th century, Gottlob Ephraim Lessing, who was, by the way, also a big philosopher of education. And in his theater piece called Nathan der Weise in German, Nathan the Wise in English, he has this parable, the parable of the 3 rings. So once upon a day, there was a king who dies, and he has 3 sons. So the 3 sons gather in front of the corpse of the father, and the elder son says, well, guys, our father gave me the ring of power, so I'm the successor. But the second son says, oh, you are a liar, I also have a ring. He gave me the ring just 5 minutes before dying. And the last son says, oh, you are all liars because I received the ring. I am the true one. I also received the ring just 1 minute before he died. And all of them have a ring, and we cannot distinguish the rings. So then, fortunately, the prophet Nathan, the prophet from King David, Nathan, comes into the room and says, guys, we won't be able to distinguish between the 3 rings. So let's wait the end of history, and then according to your ethical behavior, we will see who was truly the real successor of the king. Back then, in the 18th century, Lessing thought about the 3 monotheistic religions, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as competing to be the sons of Abraham. So the 3 rings each ring was a claim that I'm the true follower of Abraham, and he had only 3 sons. Today, thanks to globalization, we not only have 3 rings, but a myriad of rings, 1,000 rings, because we have a myriad of denominations of Christian churches, and also Buddhism, Islam, of course, Judaism, etc., etc. And we are all entering a big ethical and spiritual competition, which is who is going to best promote the care for the creation, the golden rule, power as a common good that I'm going to share with the entire creation. And that's the best competition we can enter in. Thank you.
Well, friends, you've had a chance to refresh your coffee a little bit. You see lunch is coming out, but that's for a little later. I just invite you back to some small table conversation. There's plenty to talk about from that talk, I'm sure, and you can take conversation wherever it's interesting to you. But if you need something to think about, here's what sort of jarred me. Maybe all of our faculty development offices at our various colleges could arrange a faculty trip to that fantastic school in Britain. And that woman is responsible for faculty development at Westmont. So I'm glad you were thinking that, Eileen. There is actually one, I suppose, serious thing that is serious enough, but non-programmatic theme that struck me, and it's been striking me throughout. And I suppose that's the decentering of humanity. The reference, Gaël, that you made to the Golden Rule struck me, because the Luke version has "do unto men," and hopefully doesn't mean males, but nevertheless, at the most it means humans, as you would have them do unto you. And it struck me that you might be inviting us to expand the Golden Rule beyond the human community, a decentering maybe of the human community. That was one theme that struck me. Maybe that's worth some conversation around your tables, but don't let that dictate whatever you find interesting to talk about. We'll talk for 5 or 10 minutes maybe, and then we'll have some chance to be in larger conversation with Gaël. Okay? Well, friends, much food for thought from that fantastic talk. Thank you very much again, Gaël.
You're welcome.
Boy, from high-level economics to spirituality, we got it all in that. I hope that your conversations around your tables have been good. Happy to open things up now to conversation with Gaël and with the entire room. Anything you want to start with, Gaël, in follow-up? I was struck myself by the articulation of the Golden Rule that was anthropocentric in the one case, but what seemed to me to be an invitation in your presentation to move beyond human community in our thinking about the Golden Rule. Any more thoughts on how?
Yeah, I think you got
we
it
accomplish
exactly.
that spiritually, maybe?
Yeah, this is one chapter of my PhD dissertation actually in theology, arguing that we could, maybe should, try to make the experience of the Golden Rule not just with human beings, but also with, animals. Why not plants? And so in this respect, I'm not going much further in this direction because there are many other questions in my dissertation. But for instance, if you look at the last book by Martha Nussbaum, which is called Justice for Animals, she essentially tries to argue that justice holds only for sentient animals. And I don't think her argument is correct because, if you take an ecosystemic viewpoint, one species has a value as a member of an entire ecosystem. And if you just withdraw the species, the entire ecosystem might fall down or might not. For instance, we love dolphins, we human beings, but dolphins are not that important, are much less important than planktons, for instance. So, and who has the same kind of empathy for planktons as for dolphins? So I think what she's actually experiencing is the Golden Rule with a number of sentient animals. But that's not what she acknowledges. She claims this would be the ground for a limitation of justice, you see. And so actually I believe most of us are already making this experience, if in a completely implicit way, and then we should reflect on it and try to go further. And that's the big challenge. And maybe from this perspective, we have to learn from indigenous populations, which are much ahead of us in this direction.
Thank you. Questions, thoughts from you all? Yes, David.
I really appreciated all of your examples that you gave, some really interesting, fabulous projects. They seem to me to go to the grid in which you had the empty magic box on the lower right-hand corner. They seem to me to be almost all examples for moving the countries that were to the left of that box into the box. And I didn't see very many examples about dealing with the countries that are above the box to get them down into the box, which seems at least as challenging and also more immediate for a lot of us who are sort of thinking about that question in our own culture. And I wonder if you have some examples that you can throw out in that category.
Yeah, I did not mention it, but it happens that we also have a contract with Deloitte, the big consulting company, in order to build models for the Eurozone, in order to understand how to really put into practice an energy transition. So this is just energy, but it's already a lot for the Eurozone. So this is one example. And it happens also that I founded a think tank in France, and with the members of this think tank, we published last year a report on how to really put into practice the energy transition for France from today to 2050 in order to be compliant with the net zero carbon commitment, And so we had to deal with all the components, the sectors of the French economy, and we tried to figure out how much it would cost and who would pay for that. So a long story short, the answer is 2% of the French GDP every year on top of usual expenditures. And it happens, I guess, just by coincidence that economists in South Africa ended up with approximately the same figure, 2%. So this is one way to try to deal with this question of, the countries which are on the top right and how they can go down. The next step for me would be to embed this kind of scenario, which is completely bottom-up, into a macroeconomic model to check all the backloop effects of this kind of scenario. Now, to be completely fair with you, I worked for many years as a kind of shadow advisor of the French government, especially under the presidency of President Hollande, not the current president, the former one. And yeah, I was not completely successful, even though I worked like crazy to offer this government a lot of information and scenarios, etc. So just to give you a flavor of that, this is my experience. I'm not saying that it is universal, but at a certain point, we ended up, because there was a whole team, of course, of people working in this direction, we ended up with 4 big families of scenarios of an energy shift for France that we provided to the French president. And we said, well, Mr. President, there are 4 main scenarios, which depend essentially upon, the fraction of the energy mix of France in 2055 that would be made of nuclear power and a number of other variables. And we said, well, these are societal choices, And he said, well, there are 4 scenarios. Are you sure there is not, a technical reason for which there would be a single scenario that will show up? And we said, no, Mr. President, these are really, choices that we have to make, and maybe we could organize a democratic debate so that people would be involved in the decision-making process, And he said, oh, that's very frustrating. And my guess is that, at this point, the political sphere has a huge role to play, and so we also have to deal with that. So, some politicians hope that there will only be technical solutions that save them from the need to make decisions and to be responsible for the decisions they're making. And I think that's bad. We really need politicians who are bold and who make, the assumption, we have to make decisions, I will be responsible. Okay, but that's history. Churchill didn't have these kind of scruples when he had to make big decisions. So we need people like Churchill today, I think.
Thank you. Jeffrey, yeah. There's a mic coming around, Jeffrey. Yeah, there you go.
Of all the slides that you showed, the most disturbing was the refugee camp and your comments about the duration of time that people are spending in these camps. In his book, The Stranger is My Guest, Michel Ager does an anthropological study of people who are displaced, and he points out that increasingly the world is filled with displaced people. Over 250 million people today living outside their own place of birth, and that this is obviously going to become more catastrophic. But he sees nation governmental structures as highly ineffective, and lauds the work of municipalities, local communities, of people who care about the stranger and don't label them as the intruder, but practice real efforts of resistance toward humanity by being humane and working against the kind of dictums of xenophobic policy. Here's the question. It seems to me that you put a lot of stock or faith, maybe I'm misreading what you're presenting, in the engagement with nation states. Is that the mechanism that's best in addressing these concerns that you raise, or is it more localized, more municipal?
Thank you, that's a great question. There is also another philosopher whom you may know, whose name is Giorgio Agamben, who is Italian, who has written a lot about the camp as being the symbol of the 21st century, unfortunately, the unfortunate symbol of it. So now going back to your question. So for the example, the precise example of Kenya, we are working mainly with a big NGO whose name is JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service. And all we need for the Kenyan government, from the Kenyan government, is a green light to organize things, nothing more than that. And probably the Kenyan government won't be able to do anything. But we politically speaking, for instance, I know that JRS tried to do the same in the south of Chad because there were many refugees from South Sudan, and the dictator back then, whom I knew, Idris Deby, said no. Even though the population over there was ready to host these refugees, pretty much in the same way Lebanese people have hosted 1.5 million people from Syria, So the resistance does not come from the population very often, but as you said, from the governments. So in this case, we don't work with the government, we just need its green light, and we are going to work with the populations on the field, definitely. Now, in other circumstances, we also have to deal with the government. For instance, South Africa, obviously we are working with the National Treasury, so that's the government level. For India, we try, I'm bargaining now with Deloitte for India, because at the federal level it's just impossible with Narendra Modi, who is a kind of crazy populist dictator. But at the sub-federal level, with a big company like Deloitte, which has a lot of clients, we may have a fruitful collaboration. So we are trying to dig in this direction to see how to work there.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Patrick, please.
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Gaël. I was struck by the map that you showed of hotspot areas of elevated humidity and heat, and your comment about a little bit later in relationship to the World Bank. So I worked for World Wildlife Fund for a while, and many people may remember the Myers hotspot map for conservation purposes, which was the biodiversity mega countries. There's multiple versions, but people forget that the purpose of those maps was actually to influence the World Bank and its development projects. And so, a lot of criticism has been leveled at that mapping effort and the subsequent initiatives of the bank and state government, or the state, right, various governments. So I was actually hoping you would talk a little bit more about the Suruku case and how you're working with them to empower and enable a conversation with the World Bank and their governments, which I think would be an interesting, maybe offer some insight to the previous question as well.
Sure, thank you. It's also a great question. So regarding the World Bank, my own experience, but I know there is someone over there who worked for the World Bank, so who knows the World Bank from inside, which is not my case. I worked hand in hand with the chief economist of the World Bank, whose name back then was Paul Romer, and before Paul Romer, Kaushik Basu, the Indian guy. So my experience is that the World Bank is a big bureaucracy, gigantic actually, where you have the best and the worst. That is, the research department, as far as I see today, is doing a very good job with dealing with all these questions. Biodiversity is still a mysterious topic for most of them, as it is for most economists. But now they have understood the water issue, minerals, climate change, all this is clear to them, and they publish very nice articles on this question. So people like Stefan Algat, etc. But the big problem with the World Bank is that the operations people don't read what the research department is publishing. So the operations people on the ground are still implementing the same recipe like in the 90s. Just open your frontiers to Western exports, flexibilize the labor market, reduce public spending, and everything will be fine, which is just nonsense today, I believe. So I think that's the tragedy of the World Bank. And to a lesser extent, the French Development Bank suffers from the same kind of bureaucratic inertia. Now, in what we try to do with the Amazon, for the time being, we didn't go far enough to try to think with this population with whom we are going to talk. We are still in the process of building the model with them. And for that purpose, we are working with Jesuit universities in Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. And so this is just the beginning. Probably one day we will have to, with them, talk with a number of governments and big companies, and also the World Bank, obviously. Yeah. At the same time, the World Bank today is in a very, how should I say this, fragile situation. Not just because they just got rid of their CEO, they have to find a new one. Malpass has been kicked out, and it's not going to be John Kerry because he said no. But also because they have understood that the business model of the World Bank is no longer to be sustainable in the coming years. First of all, because you have a big competitor whose name is the China Development Bank, the CDB, which is bigger than the World Bank, and which lends money at a cheaper price. So nobody can compete against the CDB, not even the World Bank, which is a big problem. And second, as you know, a big public debt crisis is looming again in sub-Saharan Africa. So the World Bank knows that it's no longer possible just to lend money. And Africa is obviously the big continent where a lot of tragedies are going to happen because they are going to get 1 billion more people within one generation, which is unheard of in the history of humanity. 1 billion more. So Africa today is 1.3 billion people, and there will be at least 2.3 billions in 2050, at least, if not 2.8 billions. And nobody knows how to deal with that. So they are perfectly aware of that, but they know that they cannot just lend money. And if they cannot lend money, what's the use of the World Bank? That's a big question for them. So the discussion I have with them now is how can we change the business model of the World Bank so that it still helps without dying in the coming years or decades.
Yeah, John, please.
I'll just first verify what you said from my own work at the World Bank, as you were alluding to. Initially, I was in the research group, working with people like Lant Pritchett and just brilliant, and then operations. And as I shared with you in the coffee break, that's the reason I left the World Bank, watching operations in action, discouraging. But as a link to my question, when I was at the bank, there was a group that met every Friday morning, and they published a monograph called Friday Morning Reflections. It was Ismail Sarageldine, David Beckham, Herman Daly at the time, and it was just a set of folks who were doing what we're trying to do, which is to say, how do we bring the spiritual into these broader challenges? And they did not succeed in lots of ways, but that calling remains. And what I wanted to hear a little bit more from you, I thought your talk was so fabulous, is about your own kind of stepping into this prophetic calling. If we look back to the 60s, you're echoing limits to growth. You're echoing Freire, actually, in some ways, as to what education should be liberating. But of course, the voice that we all were talking about in the popping session before this was Dr. King. And I wondered if you could pick up on your own reflections on the Golden Rule, his reflections on love, and his reflections on love and power, right? I mean, he said power without love is terrible, love without power may be equally bad, if not worse. And just your personal reflections, your remarkable career, how do you see that and the hope you might see in matching love and power?
Well, it's another big question. Fortunately, we have 3 days to talk about it. So at a very personal level, I would say, honestly, what changed completely my life was my stay in Chad. So I was a teacher, but I also spent a lot of time with street children. And I founded with them a center for them, which is very small, in SAR, for those who know this small city, near the frontier with Central Africa. So there are 40 children, not more than that. But I did not want it to grow, because if it grows, you have a number of predators who come, try to steal the money. So it's very small, but I'm sure the money which is sent there ends up in the stomach of the kids. And honestly, they changed completely my life because they taught me, honestly, the joy of gospel, even though they have nothing. They have broken every bridge with the world of adults. They have literally nothing except for very dirty clothing. And the first crisis of malaria, they die. So they have a level of vulnerability which is incredible. And at the same time, they were more joyful than I was. So they taught me this kind of joy, honestly. And so to give an example, a few years later, when I came back to France, I asked to become a Jesuit. And the Jesuits, so my father passed away right at the same moment. So the Jesuits told me, you have to wait and to take care of your family. And so I started working for private banks, as you mentioned earlier, as a scientific advisor. And at a certain point, they offered me a job as a trader in New York. So I was teaching mathematical finance in a big, building in Manhattan, and I knew they were about to offer me this job, and I took a break, drank a coffee in front of a big, window glass with Manhattan at your feet, etc., with helicopters in the sky, everything. And I thought, well, if I do this crazy job, when I will die and hopefully go to heaven, if I meet my street children, they will not recognize me. Like in the gospel, they will tell me, who are you? We don't know you. And I don't want this to happen. I want to be able to spend eternity playing with them, swimming in rivers full of crocodiles, eating with them, cooking with them, laughing with them. So, and honestly, that's the metaphor grounded in reality, in my own existential experience, that helped me say no. Otherwise, I was 29, you are 29, you're offered such a job, you will make millions, How do you resist to that? So many young people don't resist. Very hard to resist. I think I resisted thanks to the kids, honestly. Otherwise, maybe I would be there still today. I don't know, So they have been a kind of a compass for me in my spiritual life, and this is a beautiful experience for me. So this is my personal aspect. Now, from a more general viewpoint, I can give you another example where this question of how to really experience the golden rule matters. For instance, we had one day a discussion with people from the city, in London, at the Royal Academy of Sciences in London. And I had organized this with a friend of mine whom you know probably, James Galbraith, an economist from the US and Texas, and also Tom Heller, who founded the CPI, the Climate Policy Initiative in San Francisco. Fantastic guy of German origin, Tom Heller. So we had provided a number of presentations for people from the city about climate change and all the disasters that are looming. And at the end of the afternoon, they said, well, okay, we have understood it's going to be a mess, but we are not going to do anything for the ecological transition. And we asked, why is that so? They said, well, it's too late. People will die in Africa, but we don't really care. What we care about are our kids. We are going to put our kids in a nice private school in Sweden, which meanwhile, thanks to global warming, will become the nicest place on the planet, And I was, astonished. So we had to argue about, if we know that if we reach something like +5 degrees of global warming, probably the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will be like 1,000 ppm parts per million. With 1,000 ppm, given the fact that today it's 417, with 1,000 ppm, experiments showed that the human brain loses something like 25% of its general faculties and 50% of its acute faculties, like playing chess or solving a math problem and these kind of things. So we tried to say to these people, maybe you will put your kids in these nice private schools in Sweden, but they will be completely nuts, So is this what you want really to happen? And so my kind of quote-unquote lefty spontaneous reaction is to say, oh, these people are crazy and stupid, and they are going to destroy the planet. But it's useless to think this way. We really have to enter into the logic and to think at the place and the kind of courage it needs to accept to face the problem, and not just to find a kind of island where I could find a refuge and an escape place for myself and my kids and my family. So And this is where we really try to engage the conversation. And if I just go home and say, well, these people are stupid and are criminals, nothing happens. If I really try to discuss with them, then we might find a way, you know. I believe. I think so.
Maybe that's a good place to end our conversations. Let's thank Gaël Giraud. We have lunch available here. Some of you may need to grab and go. There are, I think, containers for that at the end of the table, or maybe over here on the end of this table. We aren't going to have the opportunity maybe to have a captive audience again. So let me say two things. One, practical. Inside your folders, you'll find a little QR code that'll take you to a very fast little response opportunity for you. We love your feedback on this gathering. Critical is actually better than anything. Always good for us to learn how we can do better. So please feel free to use that. We'd be grateful for that. The folders that you have obviously are made out of petroleum. That's a bummer. But that does make them last a long time. If you'll take them home and use them, please do. If you don't anticipate using them, we'll be happy to keep it and use it again. Okay? So we'll practice a little reuse since we can't really recycle. So we'll be grateful for that as well. We've seen some people have to leave already, so it's not everybody who needs to will hear this, but I have to say I am just filled with gratitude. I'm grateful to the three that we had the opportunity to hear from in our keynote sessions. Gaël, thank you very much for today. Jeff, thank you for yesterday. Athena's had to leave already. I found our small group conversations just fantastic, the ones that I was a part of. Very grateful to those of you who saw fit to offer us something and contribute in the ways that you did. Really grateful to the students who were able to take part. We might be down to one. Conrad, thank you. Two. Grace is here as well. The student contributions I thought yesterday morning were terrific, and also just their participation in conversations throughout was fantastic. To those of you who journeyed here to see us, we've been with friends that we've seen in the past. We're grateful for your returning to us. For folks who are here for the first time, thanks for taking a chance on a strange little experience. This is not like things you might typically encounter, so we're grateful for you taking a risk on this. Please enjoy a delicious lunch. We wish you safe journeys home, and thanks again for being with us.